reading my bio, I was wondering why Frank asked me to do this, but then I kind of realized I've been doing this for 20 years, which makes me an old-timer in a lot of this field, which, I mean, that's really dumbfounding because I feel like I just started. And, I mean, I think that's the joy of chaplaincy is you can still continue learning on a daily basis and pick up new things and reach new horizons, even if you've been doing it for 20 years. So we're going to talk about maintaining our theological roots. Why do we even really need to worry about our roots? I live in the Sacramento area. We're about a mile or an hour and a half from Big Trees State Park. It's similar to Sequoia National Park, where we have redwood trees that are 30 foot in diameter. We also have the coastal redwoods. I was there with, this is a picture I took this summer with my family. Those trees get to 350 feet. The amazing thing about these trees is their roots only go down about 6 feet. So they're 350 feet tall, but they have this very short root system, but it's sprawled out. It spreads out for 100 feet around the tree, and then they intertwine with everything underground, and that keeps them from falling down. So you really don't see lone redwoods. You usually see redwoods in a pack. And we have some in our backyard, and I cut one down, and the guy said, well, if you want to keep your redwoods, you better keep the two of them. You can't cut down two. If you have just one there, it might fall over in a bad storm. I was like, oh, I didn't know that. But it's really an interesting phenomenon is the stretch that we have in these redwoods, how little is actually supplied from underneath, but it's very valuable and very important. So why do we even need to worry about this? Well, without that healthy root system, the trees would just fall, or they'd die. In interfaith work, I see it as a lot like these redwoods, particularly in chaplaincy. We are stretching above and beyond horizons that we ever thought we would with other religions, with those who have no faith. And I mean, we're reaching strong heights, but if we don't take care of those roots in our theology and take care of who we are academically, but also religiously, we have a tendency to tumble and fall. As a CPE supervisor, I give a similar presentation to my students because I watch some of them get in and they just get lost. They don't really understand what they believe, and that ends up making them either leave the ministry altogether or definitely not be able to be chaplains because it's just really tough on them. So I hit that wall myself in my third unit of CPE. I was in a group. I'm from the San Francisco area, so I was in a group made up mostly of Berkeley students. So as a Latter-day Saint in a group full of Berkeley students, you can imagine I was a little out of place. And I was asked a question about some of my core beliefs in the midst of our group. And so as I shared them, I didn't really think of my audience very well. And so I shared some things that ended up being very offensive to one of my peers. And this happened to be one of my peers who's my closest friend in the group. And she was just livid. I heard every four-letter word you can imagine coming at me from her. And my group just sat there paralyzed. And my supervisor, thanks, he didn't really help me in this moment because he just got the rest of the group and then walked away and left me and this peer in the room together. Well, eventually this peer asked me to go on a walk, or I asked her, I can't remember, but we ended up on a walk. And as we were talking, she just looked at me, she goes, how do you do this? I was like, how do I do what? She goes, how do you do this ministry? I see you do good things. I see you do godly things, but I disagree with you on some fundamental things. How do you actually believe what you believe and do this as a ministry? And I mean, I posed the same question to her, but it ended up with a really good dialogue. I thought it was a great question, and it's one that's been with me ever since I did this in 1997. So how do we actually manage this balance of being active, faithful Latter-day Saints working in this interfaith world? I love these scriptures. This is basically, if you remember, you cannot serve God and mammon, but we're then commanded in both Luke 16:9 and the D&C 82:22 to make ourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness. So we are asked to be in tension. We can't serve God and mammon, but we need to be friends with the mammon of unrighteousness. So that's a place that chaplains live in constantly. We have to be part of both worlds. And if you can't, then it's a difficult job to do. So why do we even bother with making sure we have religious endorsement? These are all the, not all the all the agencies that require endorsement for chaplaincy. Just a good long listing. I won't go through all the acronyms. What's interesting is there's a new organization that's come up, the Spiritual Care Association. They don't require endorsement or a theological education for them to certify as chaplains, and that's brought up an interesting discussion among professional chaplaincies on the value and importance of endorsement. Why do we actually have to tie ourselves to a faith tradition in this secularized world? Well, it's a question I've asked with my students, and they ask me quite frequently. So, let's see. Come on. Advance. There we go. So endorsement is really about the connection with our faith group. We need to have those connections. And I like to liken it to a buoy. And chaplaincy is very much like a buoy. I give this analogy often with my students, is we are in the sea, floating up and down. We bob up and down. And we're there to help people navigate around us. And not necessarily trying to get in their way, but we're there just to help them as they go through their lives to say, okay, somebody's out there that I can connect to, that I can then figure out how to navigate all this. Our theology is really the chain that anchors us to the bottom. That's what we believe. And our endorsement is the anchor itself. And without that anchor, we might get lost and just float away. And I've watched that happen to students. I've been in a space when I was in graduate school and doing CPE, I hadn't really looked at suffering. I was 27. Suffering was something I just hadn't experienced in my own life. And then I started to work with hospital patients that were going through unheard of suffering, either through cancer, losing children, just death that wasn't expected. And I started to get kind of lost because I didn't know what to do with it. I thought, as long as I come in and have a good scripture and pray, we'll all be happy. And I couldn't do it. And so what I was able to do, my buoy at that time was Elie Wiesel. I was able to pull up his writings and read his experiences, particularly going through the Holocaust in the camps, recognizing if he could still have faith after all these years of struggling with his relationship with God, I can do something. I can tie myself down somewhere and I'll be able to have an anchor. So if he can do it, he was my buoy. I knew I could at least tie my theology down. Oh, my student made this. I forgot he put the boat in. Chaplaincy is in constant tension. I'm going to have to read this a little bit up here. In chaplaincy itself, we are usually a small contingent. We talked a little bit about this morning. In a hospital, for a while, I was the only chaplain as the only department director with a department of one. I think a lot of people feel that way, at least in healthcare, but also in the military. I mean, you're not a huge branch, and we were told it's the smallest branch in the military. Nobody really knows what we actually do. The chaplaincy is a hard thing to define because unless you experience chaplaincy, you really don't know the benefit. And so we could sit down and explain to people the value of having somebody listen to them, but it's not something that's easily defined. In the healthcare world, we're not mandated, we don't have licensure. And so unlike all the other fields, I mean, we have to basically sell ourselves and tell people what we're doing and explain why we're valuable. We also don't necessarily know where we belong in terms of who are we actually ministering to. So in terms of the hospital, am I ministering to my clinical patients? Do I minister to the staff or do I minister to the management? And actually I minister to all three, so I don't really fit into any of those because I'm trying to take care of all of those. We had the union went on a strike, and I was asked by the shop steward to go off and say a prayer with the union as they were striking with the nurses, and I had to turn her down because I had to explain, I can pray with you, but if I do, then I'm taking sides. And I'm also the chaplain to the management. So I can't really be in a position where I pick one side over the other. Are you with the troops or with the officers? I mean, who do you minister to when you're in that position? I had a student who is a prison chaplain, and I brought this up earlier today, but one of the things he discovered was when he showed up, everybody thought chaplains were just for the prisoners. He started to pay attention to the guards, and their life changed there at the prison because all of a sudden somebody cared about them. And he didn't understand that you had to pick sides when he started that job. That it was his ignorance that actually made him successful, because everybody expected him to just go in and only be a prisoner advocate and not actually talk to the guards themselves. And then we're endorsed, but we're not necessarily clergy, and that's within any of the faith traditions. Even if they are clergy and chaplaincy, I talk to my Methodist and Presbyterian friends particularly, they're always kind of this little segment that's not part of the larger clergy body. And so chaplains, we're just an odd sort. And I mean, we like each other, we get along with each other, and we like being around each other, we like what we do, but just nobody quite understands our conversations when we start talking. And then as LDS chaplains, I mean, the military puts us as Protestants, so we're not really listed as being, even our own faith. On the other hand, the military puts us as Protestants, so we're able to blend in with all the Protestant chaplains. So, I mean, there's a plus and minus of that. We really have no professional clergy class, and so a lot of the clergy we work with don't quite understand how it works as an LDS member to be a chaplain, because we don't have the same steps that you go through to become an ordained clergy. We don't go to seminary, we don't go through this ordination track, we don't go through the boards. It's a little bit different. There's an uphill battle, I think, we fight as LDS chaplains. I'll just share my own experience. In graduate school, I remember being asked to do a little presentation on Mormon beliefs, since I was the only member of our church in my school. I was at the Lutheran school, which was attached to the GTU. And I asked one of my peers, I said, hey, I've been asked to do this, what do you think? And she goes, oh, I'd only attend if you had a recovering Mormon with you. And I thought, really? I'm not even trusted to talk to you about what I actually believe? That's interesting. And so fortunately, the Episcopalians brought me in, and they let me do it there, and it was a good experience. I had to get equivalencies. As I went through my certification, I had to get an equivalency for ordination, because all men are ordained in the church. So, ordination's not something as special in our church, at least to the outside world, because half the people in the church can get it. I had to go through equivalencies for my education, because, again, at that time, we didn't even have the BYU program. So I got an MA in theology, and I had to do an equivalency for that, and I had to do an equivalency for endorsement, because at that point we didn't have endorsement for healthcare chaplains. So, I mean, on 3 levels, I was already not included with all my peers. And then my peer interactions. I remember my first day of CPE, I had a peer, we met together, then we went down to lunch, and she was right in front of me in line as we were getting lunch. She goes, I told our supervisor I'd be happy to work with anybody of any faith. I was really excited. I could work with a Hindu, a Muslim, Buddhist, you name it, I'd be happy. Everybody but a Mormon. And here you are. And then she just walked away. I'm sitting there thinking, what? What do you mean? So, I mean, she was from the South, and it was an interesting experience, but I had to learn to overcome that, to become friends with her, and to actually become a colleague and peer. And I mean, that's just something that we're faced with. And then professional certifications. When I went up for my board certification, one of the committee members did not want to allow me to get board certified, and it all had to do with my being a member of the church. She'd had some experience in the past where a couple of her families in her church had left and joined our church, and then they were evangelizing her congregation, so she just didn't trust that we couldn't evangelize. And she ended up being not a no vote, but she abstained from voting, because she just realized, I can't vote for you, I just don't trust you, prove me wrong. What's nice is this individual later served with me on some state leadership under the APC chaplaincy organization we had. And she came up, she apologized, she said, you did prove me wrong. But it was tough when you're trying to get into a club, and the club's saying, we just don't want you, particularly when it's an interfaith club, and they're priding themselves on being interfaith, but it's your faith that's keeping you out. So. And then in work life, when I got hired, I worked for Sutter Health. Our CEO at the time happened to be LDS, and I can't tell you how often I heard, oh, you must have been hired because of him. I'd never met him, but it was just an assumption. If you're a Mormon chaplain, then that's the only reason you'd actually be hired, is because you had connections, because there's no other reason they'd hire a Mormon chaplain. So, I mean, it's been kind of fun. But it's been good, and I've enjoyed those conversations, because usually what happens is they start to realize that it's just not as important in terms of what we do in ministry as they're making it at the beginning. And so being LDS, we're great chaplains. The other hard thing is, members of the church, we like answers. I remember I got into grad school, and my professors hated me because I had an answer to every question they'd throw out. They'd throw out these rhetorical, difficult, paradoxical questions, and I'd show up with some scripture from one of our 4 standard works and say, well, no, here's the answer, and they would just get so irritated with me. And we enter, though, as chaplains, we enter into a world of ambiguity. We really find situations, there might be answers in the future, but in the moment we're with people, you really don't have an answer on why their child just passed away. You don't have an answer why somebody was killed in action. You just don't have those answers, and it's hard when you're in that ambiguity, particularly when you're used to having answers. Let's see. But also being LDS is we can see things from different perspectives. We're objective observers. We're not really accepted by either side in terms of the religious paradigm of liberal or conservative, which is, I think, one of the greatest blessings of being a member of the church. When I was in grad school, it's a pretty liberal school, but in the time I was there, it was, the mainline Protestants, it was interesting because I wasn't accepted by most of the kids there for study group, but neither were some who were on the far liberal end either. And so what was interesting is we'd meet each other outside the circle to do study groups because we just weren't accepted by either group. It was kind of nice. And we became friends and we were able to dialogue and they were able to have better understandings for some of our values and some of our views. And I was able to have a better understanding of where they were coming from. But that dialogue, sometimes being on the outside is actually a really nice place to be because we can look from the outside in and see where things are not necessarily going right. I'm always on the alert about evangelism. I remember I had a peer interaction when I was in hospice. We were doing a hospice chaplain meeting, and one of my peers who came from a more liberal tradition had talked about a win. And he had been with a young man who had attempted suicide, and he had attempted suicide because he felt that his personal choices of looking at images on the computer had actually caused him great damage with him and God. And his faith led him to believe he couldn't be forgiven. And so this chaplain was talking about how great it was that he was able to help this young man change his theology. And he went in and explained that God doesn't, care about what we do. Our bodies are made for our own enjoyment and benefit, and why would God make a body like that? And the way the discussion is he was just very pleased with his theology's changed. He now believes in a different God than he did when I started. And isn't that great as a chaplain that I did that? And my only thought was, you just evangelized. You took your theology and imposed it on a patient instead of trying to figure out what the patient actually wanted. How does that patient find forgiveness? How does that patient look for reconciliation within his own faith tradition? Not how does a chaplain impose that? And because everybody's watching Mormons, particularly for evangelization, I'm hyper on the alert when I see it coming from one direction or the other, because I know that's something that we just can't do. And I've had a discussion with that chaplain. It's been a really good discussion. And I've had discussions with other chaplains about that when I see them starting to impose their theology. What happens in a world, particularly in healthcare chaplaincy, which tends to lean more liberal, is if you're speaking to the choir, nobody decides to contradict it. But I'm there to contradict it because I'm really not part of that group either. The other one, I walked into our chapel one day at the hospital, this is about 5-6 years ago, and I noticed a pair of women there, and I talked to them a little bit. And they'd had a family member in the ICU, and so I was like, okay, well, you're welcome to use the chapel. Well, 3 weeks later, I go in, and the pair of women are still there. And I said, oh, is your family member still here? They said, oh, no, he was discharged 2 weeks ago. I was like, really? Oh, what are you doing here? Oh, we like to come in on Thursday mornings, and we like to sit in the chapel from 8 to 10, and anybody who comes in, we'll offer to pray with them. And I thought, yeah, you can't do that. This is it's a public space. You're imposing your values onto patients who may come in or family members who may come in. And they just started to argue, but it's a free place to be. Why can't we do this? And I said, well, honestly, and this is before HIPAA, but HIPAA is the easiest way to, it's healthcare law just doesn't allow it for privacy issues. But at this point, I just said, well, if I let you guys come in, I have to let other people come in. I have to let the Jehovah's Witnesses come in. I have to let the Mormons come in. And they're like, oh, Mormons, no, not that. And they got up and walked out. So it's been nice to be able to use that sometimes to help maintain some of the evangelism that's going on in the hospital. And I've had that difficult conversation where I have to call a mission president and talk about the missionaries who are coming in and using their privilege as missionaries to go room to room and explaining how that doesn't happen and how we can't do that. And those are always interesting conversations, but we're on alert about that as LDS chaplains. We also understand our ecclesial boundaries. I'll get on a little soapbox. One of my biggest pet peeves as a chaplain is when I hear other chaplains pretending to do the rites of another religion and not informing the family or the patient that they're not of that faith. And so particularly I'll have people say, well, the Catholic priest didn't show up, but I grabbed some oil, I grabbed their book, and I did the last rites. I'm like, well, first of all, it's not last rites anymore. But that's not your place to pretend to be clergy from somebody else. And being LDS and recognizing the importance of what it means to have the priesthood, I wouldn't want somebody coming in and doing a priesthood blessing if they weren't actually priesthood holders. So I'm very aware of where my boundaries are and where the boundaries of others should be, and make sure, particularly in our hospital, and if I have anything to say with training, that doesn't happen, because I know it's offensive to others, and I don't want to be pretending to be something I'm not. And then we also encourage our students or our colleagues to walk the walk. So one of my favorite encounters I had with a student was, she came in, she was very excited. She's like, I did it. I'm like, did what? She's like, I talked to a non-Christian and I prayed with her and it was great. I'm like, really? Tell me about it. Well, she's a Mormon lady, and I just looked and I said, okay, so back up, tell me a little bit about what that means. Well, she's not Christian, she's going to hell. I'm like, do you know I'm Mormon? She goes, yeah, but you're different. I'm like, no, I kind of believe everything. And she's, huh? And I said, I want you, this was on a supervision. I said, I want you to go take the next week and put some thought and energy into it, and ask God, in your tradition, what it means to be trained by somebody who's going to hell. And she struggled with that over a couple of weeks. And she came back, she says, I concluded something a little different. I said, what? She goes, well, you're not going, but some Mormons might. I'm like, well, what's the difference? She goes, well, if you don't really believe, that weird stuff. I'm like, but I believe the weird stuff. I'm through and through Mormon. And she's like, I'll come back next week. But this ended up being a study. It was a great experience for her as a student, because I don't worry about what her theology says about me. What I'm more worried about is, how is she encountering our patients if she's already determined they're going to a certain place in the next life. If there's no hope for potential salvation, if there's no hope that you can actually dialogue or that God can speak to our patients, she shouldn't be a chaplain. And so I wanted her to really struggle with it. And she ended up exiting herself out of chaplaincy. I don't know if it was particularly around our conversation, but it was just one of those dialogues we had. We left on really good terms, and she really appreciated the training, but it was just something I knew I needed to work with her on. But being a Latter-day Saint allows me to come in from a context that, I kind of believe a lot of the stuff you do as well, but yeah, there's some weird stuff that you just don't quite accept, and that's all right. And then volunteer screening. I can tell you, I tell people I'm LDS when I get volunteer applicants or CPE applicants. Once they hear, I can tell whether or not they'll be a chaplain, because they'll either never follow up with me again, or they'll actually come in and do the training and they have no problem with it. And if I want a chaplain in the hospital and I want to work with a chaplain, I want one who doesn't see my faith as an issue, because those are people who will not see the patient's faith as an issue. So it's a great opportunity as a member of the church to really just hold it out there. I'm very proud of it. I talk about it. I did have an experience, and when I first started, I don't have it in the slides, I wasn't getting applicants to our CPE program, so I took my faith affiliation off our website. And it was amazing how many more applicants I started to get. And then I was told by one of my peers who were part of their program, she said, well, we all have our faith tradition, why don't you have yours? So I explained it to her. She goes, that can't be true. And so I showed her the numbers. She goes, oh my gosh. It was just an amazing. But she really encouraged me to put my faith group back on the website. She's like, you know what, you're at a point, if they can't be chaplains with a Mormon supervisor, you've done the work. If they can't do that, then they don't need to be chaplains with us. And it was a really neat opportunity to get that affirmation from my own set of peers as well. And needless to say, nothing's, the applicants have still been coming in. So I think LDS theology is actually particularly well suited to chaplaincy. The idea of eternal progression is a really good theological tether for us. The idea that every patient I meet has this divine potential within them. Doesn't matter what they're doing, why they're in the hospital, where they're at in their life, what choices they're making. There's still this divine potential that I can try and latch onto and help them at least discover that within themselves they've got more strength than they need. There is no dividing line between us and them in terms of who's saved and who's not. Everybody has that potential. And everybody has that everybody sees them as divine potential in the church. I like the idea that we have salvation not just in this life, but you can actually gain salvation in the next. So when I get somebody who's desiring baptism because grandpa didn't join a church, I can't do that anyway. He told me not to tap that, and I've done it twice now. So, while I wouldn't baptize grandpa who's unconscious, and as a member of the church, I wouldn't baptize him anyway.
I'm not so worried about where he's at in this life or the next. And so I don't have this agenda where I feel like I have to really get in there and move. I can more talk about the feelings of the family, of where they're at, knowing that grandpa who's dying chose not to make these decisions in his life. What's that like for them? How are they going to grieve that? What can they do? What reconciliation do they have in their faith for those choices? I like this. I don't have to seal a deal when I'm in there. I have a lot of evangelical students, and that's the struggle they have, is I've got this person who's just so close, but as a chaplain, I can't give them the word. But I know that's what would solve the problem. And they feel really a strain between those two things. And it's something I think it's natural. It comes from the idea of wanting to evangelize, but it's not what we do as chaplains. I love the idea that we have an eternal nature as family. We're able to actually reach out and recognize that loved ones surround us not on just this side of the veil, but on the other. And when families or patients talk about, grandma keeps coming down according to the patient and keeps saying, hi, what do you think, chaplain? I don't have to go into a theological discussion. I say, of course, why couldn't grandma come? I've already got into my belief system. And then I think the recognition that our Father in heaven speaks to other religions makes it real easy to work in chaplaincy. And so my dad is institute director, as was mentioned. He brought me, as I started chaplaincy, he made sure I got this quote. This is the first presidency statement in 1978. It came out as a statement, and then President Faust in 2004 in the April conference quoted it. But it just basically states, the great religious leaders of the world, such as Muhammad, Confucius, and the reformers, as well as philosophers, including Socrates, Plato, and others, received a portion of God's light. Moral truths were given to them by God to enliven whole nations and to bring a higher level of understanding to individuals. Consistent with these truths, we believe that God has given and will give to all people sufficient knowledge to help them on their way to eternal salvation, either in this life or in the life to come. So the idea that, our faith, while it has the truths of salvation, we also believe that God will speak to other peoples and other faiths. And I think that's a great thing for chaplains to be able to recognize is, what truths are you getting? And what truths are you receiving from God that I can hear and listen to? It actually creates an inbred curiosity for other beliefs. So in my own life, to try and get my roots intertwined, to make sure I had some strength, I was overwhelmed as I started doing this chaplaincy. I mean, the difficult situations that you find yourself in, and I think it's in all branches of chaplaincy, we are in those places where the answers aren't, made it really hard for me. So I make sure whenever I go to a conference, I go to the temple. So I'll take time out and make sure I go to the temple. I was in San Diego last week. The temple was closed, but I made sure I went up and walked around the grounds. And I do that just to make sure I'm tying in not only to my chaplaincy training, but also into my theological roots. I attend the temple at home as well, but it's just something I do to let people know that it's valuable to me. I also volunteered when I was in CPE and starting work. I volunteered to teach institute. I did 4 years at our local institute. I wanted to make sure I understood my theology just as much as I was trying to understand other theologies. I got involved with stake public affairs, first as a volunteer. I mean, chaplains are instant networkers. We know most of the clergy in the area. I've had to shout down Catholic priests in our public affairs is trying to get a meeting with them, and so I've had to at times say, I've had to kick him out of the hospital multiple times for bad behavior. I don't know if you want me in that meeting to create but they're like, but you know who he is. Yeah, absolutely. I call him every week, and if he's in, sometimes I have to call the rabbi, sometimes I have to kick out the rabbi. So yeah, I know them. And so getting involved with public affairs was really helpful. And this is a statement from their website. This was a couple years ago. But it's, though public affairs work focuses on those not of our faith, conversion is not its main goal. Public affairs is primarily concerned with creating and maintaining positive relationships with key individuals. That became my byline, basically, as an LDS chaplain. What am I there to do? I'm there to create relationships with key individuals. It made I want to share some gospel messages. I need to make sure I get the missionaries to those. That's not my job. My job is to make sure I'm maintaining relationships with key individuals. And I think it's been very helpful to have something like that to fall back on. Come on. There we go. Oops. Go back. There. I also reached out to other LDS members. There are a few in here in this group that I called when I was first starting chaplaincy, since we didn't have a network like this at the time, just to make sure I wasn't alone in the process. I think being a chaplain, and particularly in a small environment, if you're in an isolated area, Mark Allison was somebody I'd call quite frequently, Alden Brown I called quite frequently, Catherine Stuckey I called quite frequently, just to make sure I had people I could talk with. And I also found funeral directors who were LDS. I think if there's any profession that kind of walks similarly to what we do and are as misunderstood as chaplains are, it's funeral directors. So I'd find LDS funeral directors and talk to them about their experiences and use them as a network. And then I also got involved with our local chapter of AMCAP, the Association of Mormon Counselors and Psychotherapists. Because again, people in therapy, they tend to be involved in also those same types of ambiguous situations. And then I keep a set of scriptures in my office where whenever I read them, I just keep chaplaincy in mind. And I read it for chaplaincy, and I particularly stay in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, because I need to have some theological framework and theological points I can turn to when something comes up. And so having scriptures where if I open them up and I see a marking, I know it had something to do with chaplaincy, I write in the margins. Now I'm doing most of it online, but it's nice to have something like that where you're able to just have that focus. And then my biggest stretch, though, I'd say one of the things that really helped me the most was writing my theory papers for ACPE. Most of the chaplaincy organizations that have certification have something similar where they ask you to engage your theology. And so I just put a list of what these were, but it really forced me to firm up what I believe. And the first question is, how do you understand persons as creatures of God, or how do you understand persons in relationship with the ultimate reality as defined by your faith tradition? So you have to engage with your faith to make sure you know, how do I actually see patients? Who are they? What do they mean to me? How does God see them? And having that question in my head and then having to write it up and really firm it down helped those roots just grow and feel like I had some stability. And then how does it inform my supervision or your chaplaincy or your ministry? It's a great question to just have, who are these people and how does God see them? And how does that actually help me relate to them as a chaplain? Then the second was, how do you critically reflect upon your own religious, spiritual heritage and current beliefs, theological practice in relationship to the culture and mission? So this is that tension. ACPE particularly, and I come out of that context, they have their own culture. Some things that we believe as members of the church may not fit with that culture. And I think all of our chaplaincy agencies are having that same issue. So what I liked about this process is it made me actually think about, how do I relate my faith to this culture that might have some differences with my faith? And then how do you think theoretically, based on your faith tradition, about interpersonal relationships, human suffering, and relationships with the transcendent or the ultimate reality? This was the hardest one for me to write, because human suffering is something we just don't talk a lot about. We want people to be happy. And it's the plan of happiness. It's the great plan of happiness. And so the idea of suffering, we recognize it's something we get through, but it's there. And to engage it with your own belief system and really recognize, how do I deal with somebody's suffering? Let me think of the worst thing that could possibly happen to me or somebody I love. And how would I see that? What would I say to them? How would I engage that? And how would I see God involved in that? Those are some tough questions that a lot of people can go their whole life never ever having to ask those questions. And chaplains are wrestling with that question on a daily basis. And then what theologians, teachers, or spiritual resources inform your theological stance or theoretical stance. So I actually had to sit down, and it was great. I wrote a paper. Joseph Smith was my theologian. And I kind of liked writing these papers. I tried to pick people nobody knew, and I already knew my theology. I didn't have any trouble. Nobody knew Joseph Smith in the ACPE world, at least. So I was able to help bring something new to them that they were able to relate to. And it's been amazing talking to some of my peers who've read my papers, because we share them around to help other people write theirs, how much value they're getting out of that, just hearing some of the framework that Joseph Smith put things in. And then they talk about our cultural context and how do we look at our cultural context as seen through our faith tradition. We could talk a lot about that. This could be I've done an hour seminar just on that area, but what really came out of these papers is my own roots got really nourished. The idea of eternal progression, and men are that they might have joy, was something that I found as I was writing these papers. The idea of joy not necessarily being happiness, but being something that's grounding and connecting was something that I came to and recognized, my patients, my students, myself, I may not be happy in the moment, but if I have an understanding of who I am eternally, I could still have joy. And that has helped me manage some very difficult situations. The idea of free agency. My patients, the people I work with, they have their own choices, and they're supposed to have their own choices. And if I tell them something otherwise, I'm actually going against a core value of our faith tradition, which is the idea that we're all agents. I love that patients are agents unto themselves from D&C 104:17. But also the idea that there's opposition in all things. So we need to expect it. It's going to be there. And again, as chaplains, we sometimes live right in the middle of that opposition, and we have to navigate and balance both sides. The role of experience. One of my buoys that I was able to navigate with was just basically sections 121 and 122. I love those sections, particularly the first 6 verses of 121 where it's Joseph's lament, and then 122 where it's really a chaplain-like response. It's like, I'm not fixing the situation, but you're going through it, and I see you going through it, and just know Christ has gone through worse. I mean, it's a really powerful way to look at my own life and then the life of patients is how can I just be that presence to just watch somebody go through what they're going through. Sin is actually sometimes important. Ether 12:27 talks about our weaknesses and how those things can become strong again. And so if we can look at our areas of, not necessarily in ourselves, but as people make choices that end up being considered sin, it's okay. It fits. And they need to do that so they could actually have the experience of maybe some opposition so they can find joy. And as a chaplain, we can be there as a journey through that. And then one of my favorites is, as I've been going through this, is just recognizing the Savior was an excellent chaplain. I have a number of evangelical students who come through and, again, they want to use some of the opportunity to preach. And I've always turned them back and said, go back to the scriptures, read the Gospels, and tell me where Jesus heals somebody and says, come follow me immediately after. And so they go, and they inevitably come back, and they're like, he doesn't really do that. I said, exactly. You're in the healing place. You're not worried about saying, come follow me. You just need to heal. They'll follow on their own if that's what they need. But right now, we're just healing. And that's what hospitals are. That's what wounded soldiers are. We're just healing them. And it's not our role to have to bring them to follow because they'll discover that as we minister to them that maybe we have some light that they want to be part of. I also have a student who I got him onto this whole idea of looking at Jesus as chaplain. What he enjoyed was in Luke, I believe it's Luke 24, where Jesus is in the garden and he asked the disciples to come be with him, come watch with him. He's like, wow, Jesus, all he wanted was chaplains. He wanted his 2 disciples to come be his chaplains. Just come watch with me. And they didn't. They fell asleep. And so God sent an angel. But wow, that's all he really wanted was just a chaplain. I'm like, wow, he brought that up. I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. But it's something that we can recognize within the gospel that, yeah, if we follow the example of the Savior, we need to also treat our patients as if, and those we work with as if they were Christ. That's what we're called to do. And it's just an opportunity for us to do that. So my conclusion, this is a tree I cut down, my redwood tree. It won't die because I've learned it's got a healthy root system. And so every spring I go out and I chop it all down, chop down all these little sprouts that come up off the trunk or the stump, and then they keep growing all year round. They just keep coming up. Well, that's something that redwoods do. And if we have that same healthy root system, if we have experiences that we get chopped down, and I think there are times in chaplaincy where I can walk out of a hospital. I had a 11-year-old and an 18-year-old both in it. They died at the same time. One committed suicide, and the 11-year-old was hit in a car crash. I have an 11-year-old and 18-year-old at home. I walked out of that hospital that day feeling pretty cut down to the ground because that's just the work we do. And I spent 4.5 hours with the 2 families as family member after family member came in, heard the news, gave the wail that only family members who've lost a loved one can give. And as I'm sitting there with them, I'm thinking, this is tough. This is really hard work. Fortunately,
I had a root system. So as I was feeling pretty much cut down, I knew there were places I could turn. I could turn to my theology. I could turn to my faith. I could turn to my Father in heaven, and I knew I'd be able to get through it because I've had examples of people who've gotten through it, and I've done the work to get through it. And so that's my invitation to all of you, is just really take that time to engage, get involved with your theology, get involved with what you really believe in, and put it into practice before you have to put it into practice. I think that's the key with chaplaincy, is sometimes if we don't do the work first, we're caught off guard and we end up being like that buoy just floating out to sea instead of having something that's really going to anchor us in the tough times. So while we're growing and stretching and connecting with our interfaith world, we do need to actively seek to understand our theological roots. We need them in order to keep our ability to reach out to others and keep those connections alive. It's something that I encourage all of you to take that time. The gospel is an amazing gospel. The answers that we can find for ourselves, they may not be the answers for our patients, but they're there if we just take that time to really dig and get into those roots. And these things I say in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.